So here's a final question. It's about HIV. I already did it before, but then it wasn't really recorded, so we have to do it again. So I'm just gonna go through it again, and I've already done the working for it, so hope you don't mind about that. But otherwise, it's a pretty straightforward question, and I'll just go through it as well as I could. It's about HIV and tuberculosis and how they're related. Over here it says infection with HIV increases the risk of developing tuberculosis. Tuberculosis caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and then they have a survey of patients which shows in 2008 and 2010 the number of patients who were HIV positive and negative. So then we had to calculate the percentage of patients in TB in 2008 who were HIV positive. So over here it just gives us that value. It's 800. We divide that by the total number. 800 plus 600 gives us 1400, and we just times it by 100 and we get 57.14%, and I just rounded it off to 3 significant figures. If they don't mention it, just put it to 3 significant figures, because mostly that's how the question works, and you probably would see it on the start of the paper. I don't know, sometimes they do mention it, but I don't know if they mention it over here. No, they don't. But if they didn't mention it, just put it to 3 significant figures. But I just write everything just in case, and I just show your working just in case, because even if you got the answer wrong, if you had the working correct, you will still get the mark. So next question was describe how the proportion of patients who were HIV positive in 2008 compares with proportions of patients who were HIV positive in 2010. So again, it says describe over here. That's the important part that we need to take away, is that it says describe. So we don't need any knowledge of HIV or TB. We don't need to mention any of that. We just need to look at the table, manipulate a few values, and just describe what's happening. So if you just look at it, you'll know that more patients had HIV in 2008. And in 2010, there was a less percentage of people, even though more people were getting tested, but there was a less percentage of patients with TB who had HIV. So that's exactly what I mentioned. You don't need to go into any other additional detail. If it said describe and explain, then you had to explain why. But over here, we're not supposed to know that, because we could say, if there was an explain question, we could say because more awareness have been spread about HIV and tuberculosis. That could be a reason. But since they didn't, we just need to look at the graph and use it. We can also manipulate some values. We can find the percentage of patients who had TB with TB who had HIV in 2010 and then mention that in the question. But then again, even if you don't, it's still perfectly okay. Now this question is slightly a bit it's not hard per se, but the mark scheme is very specific here. So I would recommend you to write basically everything, because we don't really know what the answer might be. Because they only gave you 2 points, and if you don't get those 2 points, you're not getting the mark. So in these sort of questions, it's really like the question isn't hard, but the mark scheme is very specific here. So you need to be careful what you write over here. So the question says that the actual number of these patients who are HIV positive may be higher than the numbers in the table. Why would that be? So I mentioned 4 points because just in case one of them may not be it, I have 3 other points to back it up. So I said some people weren't tested for HIV, which is a valid point. I think that will give us 1 mark. Patients did not want to admit that they have TB. That's another mark. I said false negatives, that they did get tested, but because of some reason with how they processed it, it just didn't get in. They didn't identify it, and it was a false negative, even though that person did have HIV. And I also said they were unaware that they had HIV. This is very close to the second point, but slightly aware, like they didn't know that they had HIV, so they didn't test for it. So that's also a valid point. So over here, you need to make sure that all the points you write are valid. They're not wrong, because if they're wrong, even if you wrote 2 correct points, you won't get the mark. The next one is also relatively simple. We need to tell about hospital codes of practice, which reduce the rate at which antibiotic resistance is increasing. So obviously one of the most major reasons will be because people don't complete their antibiotic course. And obviously that has a huge impact, because if they don't complete their course, that means that there's still some bacteria that's living inside their body, and they're going to mutate, and then it's going to grow resistant. So we need to stop that resistance. So that's one reason, that's one valid point. Then the second thing that we can say is that we need to sterilize the hospital premises. Like, the counter should be cleaned after every appointment so that pathogens, they don't travel and mutate. Now over here, you should be very specific about what it says. Even though I did say sterilize the hospital premises, you need to explain how. What can you do to sterilize? What you can include anything else, like sterilizing equipment, using, those sprays, antibacterial sprays for using before using equipment, like sanitizing the work desks before meeting patients. You should be very specific with what you say. And I also said doctors and medical staff should hand wash regularly to reduce spread of pathogens. Then again, this is just a type of aseptic technique. It also works. It's just being more specific when I say sterilize the hospital. Because the hospital is very generic and very weak, it might not get the mark. And then correct antibiotic to be given to patients. So we know that there are two types of antibiotics, narrow and broad spectrum. We need to make sure that we're giving the right one, because narrow spectrum ones only work on a couple of bacteria, and they don't work on some, so we have to make sure that it's really hard to generate more and more antibiotics, to process them, to put them through clinical phases and everything. So we should be very careful with what we're giving to our patients, because if it's not working, if you give them the wrong one, obviously it could mutate, it's no longer going to be effective anymore, and we have to come up with a new one, and that's going to put in additional costs on pharmaceutical companies. So we need to make sure that we have to give them the correct antibiotic here. And that's basically it. That's the 9 marks in this question. This question wasn't really hard for like the final question, and there wasn't even an asterisk question, so I think no one should have actually that much of a problem here. The only thing that I would say where you could possibly lose marks would be in this question, and that's just basically because the mark scheme is really specific, so you have to be very careful with what you write. Other than that, I think there's no nothing really hard. This was a very simple question, to be fair, and that's basically it. That's completing this past paper right there. So we're done. We're gonna start off with June 2016 later, and then we're gonna work our way to the latest ones, which are 2023 ones, and then go from there. That's it. Bye.